Okay. So with that, I'd like to introduce myself. I'll be your moderator for the panel today. My name is Benita Horn, and I have been, well, let's see. I am the Inclusion and Equity Consultant for the City of Renton, and that's what brings me here today. I just wanted to share with you the vision for governing for racial equity and inclusion, or as we call ourselves, GREI. We envision that all King County communities are served by passionate, informed, and supported government officials who are committed to pursuing and funding policies and practices that result in equitable outcomes and racial justice. And for our virtual event series, we have created the following guiding principles. We are interconnected, and it takes all of us working together to make changes. We will build relationships, trust, and empathy while addressing historical and current harms. We will defer to communities most impacted by racism to address how government can operate and be aligned. We will learn and apply the lessons learned by naming impacts and prioritizing them. As gatekeepers, we play key roles and are points of connection to the community, a role with a lot of responsibility and that can be used to shift power to communities impacted by racism and other forms of oppression. So I want to just mention to you that we have this opening session, which is our plenary session, in which I'll be introducing to you, or we'll ask them to introduce themselves, each of our 4 panel members today. And then we will be going into breakout sessions, which you selected at the time you registered, which will allow you to spend time with the panel member of your choice to go more deeply into their experience and knowledge. So I'm going to ask each of our panel members to introduce themselves at the start of their presentation in this plenary, and to speak to the following. And you're each going to have 12 minutes. And as your moderator, part of my role is to keep track of time. So if I nudge you, I'll give you like a 1 minute before the end of your time so that you can wrap up your thoughts. So in this plenary session, we're going to ask you to share an overview of your experience using a racial equity tool. What prompted you to use a racial equity tool? What was your goal? And what helped you to operationalize using a racial equity tool and to get decision makers on board? So our esteemed panel members are going to go in this order. Councilmember Deshaun Quinn of Tukwila, Rick Reyes of City of Seattle, Office of Art and Culture, Brian Sandler, City of Renton, Human Resources and Risk Management, and Scott Wynn, who is a consultant, an adjunct professor at UW, and he's going to fill in the rest of the blanks. So we'll start, Councilmember Deshaun, we'll start with you, and 12 minutes, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deshaun Quinn. I am a Tukwila City Council member, but I think the reason why I'm here is my work, not only in Tukwila, but in particular in King County, as I think initially equity implementation manager, but also the work of the mobility framework. And so to kind of answer the starting questions, what racial equity tool did we use? At King County, we have the Equity and Social Justice Ordinance that was passed as an initiative in 2008 and then passed by the full County Council in 2010. We applied that to actually build a mobility framework that was also informed by another tool, which was the Greenlighting Institute, which focused on lifting up communities into the decision-making process around transportation. So I know I have 12 minutes, and I'm just trying to think of the most key things that I want to say. First of all, it's very important when you talk about a racial equity tool to really focus on elevating voices for lived experiences. And some of our guiding light in some of the work at Metro, I would say, is encompassed by 4 rules. It's not my own, and I will quote a former employee at King County Transit, which our focus for the agency was: 1, share power; 2, interrupt business as usual; 3, replace it with something better; and 4, get comfortable with discomfort. So that was really our starting approach in really elevating community voices. We actually built it off a previous effort, which was the Open Space Equity Initiative, something that I'm very proud to have been a co-chair for. The initial conversation began when we looked at conservation futures tax and thinking about open space. And one of the requirements that I had in my role as a council member, but also my familiarity with equity and social justice, was it needed to be represented in the direction that we were going. And so the great thing is we were able to incorporate equity and having it at the center, because the goal was to make sure that communities in urban areas saw themselves reflected in the effort to develop and enhance open space and access to parks across the county. So that was something that I was proud of. It took over 2 years. We actually developed what is called an equity cabinet, where we looked for members of a community from community-based organizations that would represent on behalf of the voices focusing on equity. And one of the other kind of considerations was when we were going through the conservation futures tax and we were talking about reaching communities and getting their sense of how much they're committed to accessing open space and conservation, every other community could be polled except for the communities of color. Any person that does surveys always say it's a hard to reach population. So what we decided was to develop this approach of an equity cabinet, because that way we can get kind of qualitative voices to what we wanted to achieve at the county. And we wanted people to see themselves in the effort for conservation and access to parks. Some of the things that we looked at, and some of the things that you're all familiar with, is things like pollution in communities of color, health outcomes, which are contributed and are diminished when you don't have access to open space. There were many other things that we looked at, but in developing this equity cabinet, we were able to identify the needs that would go into identifying a package that could help move forward access to open space and parks. We were successful in implementing it, so much so that the county executive actually took the recommendations of the equity cabinet and built it into changing code language. And I know we're all from government and we know how fun talking about codes and charters are. But the reality was the work that we did in the equity cabinet ended up being law, ended up being able to 1, define equity, 2, define the needs that we were trying to address. And then it really built and actually showed up in the parks levy, because there were additional grant funds that were built around the recommendations that were developed by the equity cabinet. It was pretty amazing, and I know many of your cities now have the opportunity to apply for those grants. Just to give you an order of magnitude, before we had the equity cabinet, there was a limited amount of funds related to parks and open space. What we were able to bring to the table was $160 million over the course of 10 years to really focus on accessing open space and communities and have it be community led. The other thing that was done was there was an additional $10 million established with this open space equity cabinet that was focused on kind of community building and capacity building, because we knew in partnership with these community-based organizations that their time was valuable. So one, we were able to get grants so that people can sit down and plan and build support around developing access to parks and open space, planning for it, getting people to come to meetings. And then there's probably one other thing I didn't say, which is really important. The equity cabinet, we were able to pay for their time. We were paying for their brilliance and their contribution and their lived experiences and their voices and their recommendations and suggestions. I just want to make sure I'm doing okay on time. Okay. So we were able to actually then start a process that was familiar at the county around an equity cabinet. And let me just tell you, our non-traditional partners, LA County had a similar effort, which we were modeled some of our work on. So the question around, is kind of check and adjust. We looked to the LA County group to make sure we were doing this the right way. They actually flew out and met with our equity cabinet, talked to them before we developed our full and final recommendations. But we also had non-traditional partners like the environmental community, and we put at the forefront their interest in open space, but also really highlighting the value of equity being at the center of that, because it is. You can't have sustainability unless you have equity. That was something that was broadly established. We had partners like some of the other conservation entities that were trying to figure out how to engage communities, and they actually had communities there present. So I just wanted to kind of share, like Wildlife Society, all these other groups where we really kind of collaborated. And as far as accountability, we didn't move anything forward without a strong consensus from the equity cabinet. It wasn't like we were taking their information, we go away to a black box and then come back later and say, hey, can you approve this? They were part of the design and writing of the code changes. It's something that to us felt groundbreaking. And then we were able to move that into another department, because what we found was when we were talking about parks, there was so much intersectionality with the other things that we were doing at the county. So the next stop was working with King County Transit. And we were able to have an equity cabinet for transportation and developed a framework called the Mobility Framework, which I'll talk more in depth in my breakout session. But what I really want to convey is, again, focusing on elevating lived experiences. This concept of hard to reach populations, what you need to apply there is an honest effort and commitment to have those voices elevated.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I see some affirmations popping up on the screens. So our next panelist, Rick Reyes, and I'll give you a 1 minute, and you have 12 minutes, Rick.
Great. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint really quick, my little presentation for y'all. And then I'll go to slideshow. Cool. This is interesting. I've never done it on this side of Zoom, which is kind of fun. But yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for being here. My name is Rick Reyes. I'm the Racial Equity Coordinator at the Office of Arts and Culture. And mainly what I'll be talking about is just ways to move the RET for departmental decisions, but also just a little bit too around how you can kind of like work in things that you're already doing, or think about programs that you're already working on and work that into the structure of the RET. So I just wanted to start really quick. Our office has a commitment to racial equity. We envision a city where all artists, performers, writers, and creative workers have the freedom, agency, and platform to share and amplify their stories.
Excuse me, Rick.
Oh, yeah.
You're showing your next slide. And so people said something about you need to swap displays in order just to show the slide that you actually want.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Is that better?
There you go. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Yeah, and at the same time as we envision all of these things, we acknowledge that our actions, both conscious and unconscious, past and present, have benefited some communities while limiting opportunities and outcomes for communities of color. And when thinking about this, like a lot of offices, I know when I got here, I was like, this is great. We have a commitment to racial equity, but what does that actually mean? And what is the action behind it? So I wanted to pull into this nonprofit AF wizard, Voulet, who says, really what that means is that we have to look at who created these rules and definitions, and we have to look at who benefits from them most. And the RET is just one way that we can kind of build that into any like program decision, policy, or procedure that we're looking at, really examining who created these rules and definitions. For me, I got to the office about 2 years ago, and I know that like I was thinking about the RET, the Racial Equity Toolkit, and it seemed like such a difficult process because of all the bureaucracy. You're being asked to kind of fill in a form, and then you have to present it to council and then present it to the mayor. But really, once one of my coworkers, I wanted to offer up the definition that she used, but the Racial Equity Toolkit is really just another tool to ensure that you're doing accountable community engagement. And for me, what I found difficult, at least at the city, is that oftentimes, and I'm sure a lot of us feel this way, in very specific ways, but I know I've personally been asked to do community engagement under white supremacy culture. So I've been asked to fill out a form that has really perfect like lines and Excel sheets and have it in by a month, speak to as many people as possible, and we want a clear solution. But we know, or at least like what I've realized is that is not how community engagement works. That's not how relationships work. So when I'm focusing on the word accountable, for me, it's really looking at how we can shift the way that we do community engagement from white supremacy culture towards a more relational culture, a culture that values really deep and authentic relationships, that looks at our interconnectedness and values that and acknowledges healing and history and boundaries, and does so all with deep appreciation and adaptivity and flexibility. So I just kind of wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork before I sort of dove into the specific RET that I was working on. Oh no. Cool. So yeah, part of my role at the Arts Office is that I do a lot of community programming, and I do a lot of community programming with partners. So typically for me, whenever I'm looking to start like a community program, the central like large 1,000-foot view question is like, how do we intentionally create space? And a little bit more specifically, like for me, it's how do we intentionally create space for communities who are most impacted to explore the things that they want to explore. And that's the lens through which I was sort of viewing this next RET that I'm going to talk about. So before I get into it, I wanted to acknowledge 3 specific people. I wanted to acknowledge Lara Davis, former arts education manager, Elishaba Johnson, founder of Wanawari and former program manager at Arts, 4 people, Diana Falchuk, creative strategies initiative manager at OCR, and then Davida Ingram, the programs manager over at SPL. Because they really ushered in a history of community engagement. And I'll show you sort of like where I came into it, but wanted to share the history first. But basically in 2017, after Charlena Lyle's death, city staffers at Seattle Public Library, the Arts Office, and the Office of Civil Rights began to explore with that community and with their really deep existing relationships outside of that institution, how they could serve the Brettler family place in a more equitable way. And there's such like an emphasis and importance on the pre-existing relationships that they held with that community at the time, because they say this, and while you're working on the project, they said it a lot, but folks oftentimes came to Sandpoint and asked after that event, like, what can we do for you? And either there wasn't follow through, or they didn't know necessarily if they could trust the folks who were coming to them and sort of like what they'd bring. So I'll get into it a little bit more, but that pre-existing relationship and that relational culture is super, super important. But after conversations with the community, the scope started to get a little more focused. Like I say here, it widened, but it started to focus on really looking at how BIPOC communities can look at violence and do healing work together, as well as what the role for white folks are in educating each other on alternatives to calling the police. Additionally, too, we were asked to focus on modes of healing and cross-cultural strategies to help bring people together. And that was the real synergy point for us. I have this quote down here, you know, it's like, that was a really, really tragic and traumatizing event. And the community around it really requested us at the time to create an environment where we could bring together BIPOC leaders of color who could support what they were asking for. So spaces of healing, cross-cultural strategies, and not so much that like bureaucratic lingo that Deshaun was just talking about, the way that we often code language. So through that, we were able to come up with some more tactical questions together. And those were really like, how do we build community self-determination into our programs? What happens when we... I think I hear somebody. Am I? There you go. What happens when we focus on healing as a means for positive social change? And then also, you know, again, how do we build long-term relationships with BIPOC communities? So we then were sort of tasked with, like, we have these asks from community. So coming up with strategies that were rooted in those asks. And really a lot of them were centered on convening and holding space. So basically we wanted to really create a space for authentic relationships where they hadn't existed before. We wanted to obviously use like an asset-based approach, recognizing that folks have really valuable things to bring. And we wanted to center on cultural preservation, as we just see communities of color being driven apart by gentrification and by police violence. And then also we wanted to convene. We wanted to convene folks who are most affected and see how they wanted to be affirmed, and look at the relationships that we held and that we valued, and ask them, like, how the next time, if something like this happens, when something like this happens, how can we be proactively working towards affirming healing, specifically in BIPOC communities? So we were beginning to sort of like get the central question. We were getting our strategies together. And then we started thinking about the spaces that we were already a part of, and the programs that we as program designers were already working with, and the communities who we had relationships with and were building with. And at the time I mentioned Brettler Family Place. At the time, Seattle Public Library was also working with Clear Sky Native Youth Council on an oral history keeping project for Licton Springs. They're also working with Rainier Beach for food security. And, you know, we were starting to talk about 2020. Who knew it was going to go like this, but here we are. And we realized like, whoa, there's a lot of really dope BIPOC leaders who haven't necessarily talked to each other, who are all focusing on these central questions that communities were asking of us. So how can we leverage these spaces if they're interested to both meet a community demand and also hold space and look at those strategies? So we convened them together. We talked about just the asks specifically from community, and they were pretty quickly into it. And as a result, they were able to put together this project overview after really focusing on like, what do we need to heal? What are we healing from? And what's in our kind of like toolbox to heal? This was also at the same time talking about leveraging relationships that we had the opportunity to bring Adrienne Marie Brown to town, author, organizer, really dope person from Detroit. And she was sort of asking to come to town and asking another city partner around like how we can make that happen. And they were like, let's do it. Like, this seems like a really great like nexus point. So they decided they wanted to have four cohort meetings with the group of them from the community programs cohort that we put together, culminating in an eventual workshop and author reading and focus group. All in all, the event was really great. And as a result, we were able to convene around 300 BIPOC folks to really ask them, like, what does it look like to proactively plan for healing in our communities? And as a result, we've been able to put together a BIPOC programming team within the city. We continue relationships with them. So we have 3 programs together, basically, that I'm working on right now. And a lot of the cohort members planning those are from the Emergent Strategies event. And they've really been able to inform our community strategy around what does it look like and how do you want the city to communicate with you? So I have some goals here, but really like what this is about for me is how do we have meaningful relationships in a way that is iterative, that recognizes that the work isn't done, and recognizes all of the nexus points and all of the ways that we can leverage the work that's happening, basically. Because in a lot of ways, like this wasn't a formal RET, but it sort of like checked all the boxes after when I was talking to my supervisor about it, like this was definitely an RET. And I will just end with, as we're looking towards the future, we have someone named Aman on here, and I wanted to share out that they all at the RSGI, Race and Social Justice Initiative and Office of Civil Rights teams have done a great job at looking at how to create a comprehensive, condensed set of questions to make sure that we're centering race in the room. So I'll make sure that these slides get out so that folks can have those questions. But that's a little bit of overview around how I was able to work into the RET, a lot of work that I was already doing and leveraging a little bit right there.
Ricky, thank you. And you at least answered one of the questions that's come up in the chat box, and that's been asked actually of all of the panel members, the extent, you know, if you're willing to share your slides. So we'll be checking in with you all following the session. And for those of you in the audience, we will send you whatever works out for the panelists for us to send you.
Absolutely.
So with that, I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Brian Sandler. And I'll give you a 1-minute warning, Brian.
Thank you, Benita. Thank you everyone for being here today. I am Brian Sandler. I work for the City of Renton in our Human Resources Department. I'm a senior employee relations analyst, and I work in recruiting, outreach, employee relations, labor relations, and working with the civil service and police department in their recruiting and civil service roles. The context of us using an equity lens here at the City of Renton goes back to 2014, when our administrators here were learning about the process, looking at the City of Seattle's and King County toolkit to understand what an equity lens was, and then demonstrating their knowledge by using it and creating our own Renton equity lens here at the City of Renton, and using it first on a hiring policy that we have here. I think Benita was going to show my PowerPoint. I wasn't able to show it due to technology issues, but thank you, Benita. You can go to the next slide.
Okay.
I'll keep talking though. So our administrators used the equity lens, and they developed an equity lens based off of Seattle and King County, but put it in our own terms, in our own way that we could understand it and utilize for our different services here, both for our internal and external services. And we started it with our internal services and in HR with recruiting and outreach in our hiring policy. Also, our finance department has been using it for contracting and budget purposes, as well as our community economic development department using it for various uses, such as engaging the public and getting their input. My focus is going to be on human resources, mainly in outreach. And so in 2016 and 2017, Benita Horn and myself started creating the HR equity and inclusion plan. We wanted to gain an understanding of where we were at the City of Renton with respect to equity, what our challenges were, what our goals would be, how could we improve. And again, my area on this talk is HR, human resources related. And what prompted us to use it was in HR it was evident that our workforce demographics did not reflect the community population, very far off. For instance, in 2016, our workforce was about 13.4% people of color. The Renton population was about 48.8% people of color. And our city had grown very rapidly and the demographics changed very rapidly. And so we were trying to diverse our workforce more quickly. Just so you know that we have moved the needle. Our Renton workforce now is currently 20.5% people of color, but we need to move that higher. We realized during this study of using a racial equity lens that our current practices were not working. We mainly were using outreach practices, some diversity strategies, such as trying to promote a diverse interview panel to help the candidates feel welcome, but that wasn't always used. And so we knew that we wanted a plan that would make that more of our culture and reflect our values. And also we wanted to look at what were the barriers coming into the Renton workforce, there were many, but we wanted to address each one, and who was affected by our practices. And during our study, we did learn that our outreach was somewhat working, where we were getting a diverse workforce to apply. However, through the process of reviewing applications and inviting to interviews, our hiring numbers weren't that great. So we wanted to understand the data and have a more inclusive workplace culture. And so the next slide talks about our goals. And the main focus of the Renton HR inclusion plan was more towards, again, recruiting and outreach, but also trying to understand how we could have a more inclusive organization, so that if we were to when we do hire people with different backgrounds, that they would want to stay and have it maintain that diversity. And one way we thought the best way to do this would tie it to our Renton business plan. One of the goals in the Renton business plan is to build an inclusive, informed city with opportunities for all. And very recently, the council has updated this to state that to building an inclusive, informed city with equitable outcomes for all in support of social, economic, and racial justice. So there's the Renton business plan was updated, and we wanted to reflect this with a new HR inclusion plan, which we are in the process of developing and bringing forward. So the original HR inclusion plan wanted to represent a workforce that was reflective of the community. And we put out there almost 15 strategies for us to look at at a city and to develop and implement so that we could have a more diverse workforce. I'm going to go more into that in my breakout session, but that's, the Renton equity lens was to, do the research, set our outcomes, gather the data, take action, evaluate outcomes, and report back to stakeholders. And our HR inclusion plan was implemented in 2017, and now we've just reported back out to the council and to community members on what we accomplished and what we plan on doing to move it forward. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. And bringing decision makers on board included, we have a Mayor's Inclusion Task Force, and there are many members of the community that are part of that we were able to gather their insight and find out what challenges their community members were having with respect to applying and gaining employment. So we took that feedback. We also, during our implementation, we presented to administrators as well as council members. And so we had the administrators on board and trying to move down in the organization. Excuse me. We had a training session for our managers in 2018 of December, where we were able to define what equity was, what our strategies were, and to bring them on board. And again, it wasn't something that happened overnight. We worked with them after that time, one-on-one and in groups to get them to help hiring managers see the benefits and what changes we could do. Sometimes in government, we're focused on what are the old civil service rules and trying to make it fair and equitable, but is it really fair and equitable, and who is it fair and equitable to? So we had to review that and see how we were doing that. I think that's the end of that PowerPoint. So again, the Renton equity lens was helped us to develop our HR inclusion plan, which we now have a 2020 edition, which we'll be bringing forward soon. Thank you.
Okay, Brian, thank you. And under time, my goodness. Thanks so much. And I would like to now introduce to you our next panelist, Scott Wynn.
Thank you so much, Benita, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here from you and your team that did all the great work to get us here. It's great to hear about the experiences of Councilmember Quinn and Rick and Brian. So I'm looking forward to adding to the conversation. I'm going to share a little PowerPoint as well, which I think I should be able to do pretty easily. Looks like I can. Just a second. Sorry, I thought I had myself ready to go here, but luckily Brian gave me a bit more time, so I'm doing good. Okay, I'm sharing it now. I'm going to talk a bit more. I'm going to talk about who I am here in just a second, but I also want to talk a bit about what toolkits are, but also kind of importantly, the why. Why do we do toolkits? Can you all see my screen right now? Excellent. And so just briefly who I am. My name is Scott Wynn, and as Benita shared, I am a racial equity consultant. It's not showing me all of my slides though, for some reason. Oh, I took that one off. I'm a racial equity consultant, so I do a lot of work supporting grassroots groups, movements, and also government entities in really centering racial equity in their work, making it not as something they add on to their work, but something in which becomes part of their work. It's kind of like putting on a pair of glasses and it's just what you do. You do what you've been doing, you just do it differently, right? And so I do a lot of work with governments around here that extends from my work for 8 years. I was a policy and development lead for the City of Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. And that was, as you all know, the first government entity that really adopted and worked to operationalize a racial equity toolkit. And it's really important we think about, the strategy, the why of the what, the why that we do what we do. And I really think it's important we think about strategy as what's done in our heads. It's how we think about the work we do. Tactics are how we do the work. And I think racial equity toolkits are an essential tactic to do the work. And I think of a strategy as kind of like the side rails of a ladder, that when we know why we're doing things and we know how we're going to, the how of it, then the tactics are the rungs of the ladder which take us to the vision. Without a strategy, the good things we do, like toolkits and whatnot, they don't add up to something greater than their parts. A strategy makes sure what we do is taking us towards our vision, right? And I think the essence of equity work really gets at the reason and the purpose of why we need a racial equity toolkit. I talk about the work is really about understanding this triangle, getting clear that hierarchy is how business is done in governments, right? There's some at the top with more formal decision-making power than those of us usually at the bottom. This triangle also represents access to income and resources in our society. If we made a graph, it would look like this. You all know there are more poor and working class folks than there are wealthy folks. And the work of equity at its heart really is about decision-making. It's how do we understand that equity, the work of equity and justice comes down to asking who decides who gets what or who doesn't historically and today. So the work of equity is really about transforming decision-making and really working to create a profound and inclusive democracy where decisions that impact people involve people, right? The essence of racial equity work of a strategy as well is really trying to implement that inside-outside strategy, where we work to recognize that the racial equity toolkits are the nexus point between when we're on the inside and when we're on the outside. And that the work when we're on the inside is really to shift and align government institutions through coordinated alignment to center the needs, perspectives, strategies, and desired solutions, the voices and choices of BIPOC communities and grassroots organizations led by BIPOC folks outside the public sector. The toolkit kind of codifies and operationalizes that ongoing relationship building. The essence of toolkits is really to apply a racial equity lens, right? The racial equity toolkits are not really necessarily about changing decisions, although clearly they are. They're about changing the process in which decisions are made, right? And they really work to create a pause so we slow down and say, wait, what's this decision? How's it going to impact communities of color and equity, right? They're very similar to environmental impact assessment tools from the 1970s. Which required institutions to pause and say, hey, wait, what's the impact of this on the environment? Now we're trying to get governments to pause and say, wait, what's the impact of this on communities of color, on equity, right? The heart of the process is really to apply racial equity lens in decision-making. To ask, before we make a decision, what's the racial equity impact? Who will benefit from it? Who will be burdened? And how can we mitigate unintended consequences? That's the essence of a toolkit. There's a crucial process that we go through, which has been described so well up to this point to get to that. One of the organizations that I work with right now is Metro in Portland. Metro is a 3-county governmental jurisdiction around the city of Portland. And they right now are going through a process of adopting, they're calling theirs a framework. They spent, I think, too much time discussing toolkit or framework. We all love to have linguistic conversations, but they're adopting, and I'm the consultant supporting them and going through a huge process around adopting for the 3-county region a racial equity toolkit. And they're really good about really trying to kind of make granular the steps that they're doing. This toolkit is based on the work, as you all know, I was part of the city of Seattle, which there was already a toolkit when I started in 2009, but was part of a lot of reinventions of that toolkit, which really has led up to, I think, the best resource many of you have probably seen is the resource on the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, this great document which talks about the rationale and shared steps. So The steps of toolkits are all pretty much the same everywhere, but like has been said, adapting it to where you are and making it really usable where you are is crucial to this work. You know, the first step of these toolkits are to convene an internal stakeholder team that also to really guide the work internally, right? To get clear about what decision you're looking at. And then, and this was on Rick's PowerPoint later, is to really set that North Star. Ideally, your institution already has a set of North Stars, a set of audacious, probably unachievable in our lifetime outcomes we're working to get to. When we're clear on where we're trying to go, we actually increase the chance we might get there. If we don't know where we're going to go, we probably aren't going to get there, right? So setting outcomes is so crucial that are long-term, and then we can set goals to make sure we achieve it. Once we've done that, we look at the current data, we look at the baseline around the issue that we're making a decision around. We do that really concretely to determine who the most impacted community of color is, to get really clear on that. So we can then engage in what John Powell calls that targeted universal strategy to make sure those furthest away from justice and equity, that their voices and choices and desires and needs and strategies are centered in decision-making, right? And then once we've determined we've got a baseline, then we can track progress to see if we're getting someplace. And then we use that to really inform the community engagement strategy, right? And so we engage with those most impacted in order to really hear and learn their brilliance. So then once we understand their brilliance and their perspectives, we can make sure their choices are used as we apply a racial equity lens, right? At best, sometimes we should apply racial equity lens all day long on our own. But as we know, these toolkits are a process that defines a product. And we wait and apply the racial equity lens when we've determined who's most impacted, so their brilliance, their voices and choices inform the decision, right? As you know, each of these steps is a whole skill set. There's so much work that needs to be done to build skill in all of these. Setting outcomes is a skill set. We often love to set goals where we say things like to increase the number. If anytime you have, to increase something isn't an outcome, that's a goal, it's often not pretty measurable. If you're trying to increase the number of kids that graduate from a school, that means if one kid over the next 10 years graduates more than the years before, that's 100% success, right? We need to get really clear about what we're trying to get towards. I put a link in the chat box. I thought I was just uploading to later, so I'm sorry, Councilmember Quinn, I did it during your talk, but it's a really great tool about community engagement. You know, as Rick shared, that is the heart of this work, is that community engagement. And to be clear, we've confused a lot of our engagement with contact. Contacting a community is a whole different than engaging in a community. And this community engagement must be ongoing. The goal is to deepen relationships, to build that accountable relationship. Right? We often as governments, we do what I call the DAD method, where we decide, we announce, and then we defend the decision, right? The toolkits really make sure that we don't decide until we've gone through this process of centering the voices and choices of those most impacted in decision-making. Once we've done that, then we're more able to make sure that we're including folks. And I think it's so helpful to think about Senite Brown. Folks may know her. She used to work for the Race and Social Justice Initiative. We overlapped for quite a few years. And she was so clear in making sure we recognize the need to partner with and build relationships with organizations led by folks of color, right? We often, for example, you might, we do a survey of Black folks in the community. We survey 45 Black folks who've never talked to each other. They give us 45 different responses. And then we have the power to determine which of those we're going to follow, right? When we're working for government. When we engage with organizations that have already done the work and had conversations to get clear about what their choices are, that's where we're more likely to get something which might connect to and actually represent a community, right? And that's hard because we call those folks troublemakers, right? As government, when folks of color are organized into a group, we used to try to avoid them. And they're a lot hard to work with. Folks who are clear on their vision and are pushing an agenda, it takes some skill to work with folks and build that relationship, right? Because we know we can't dismiss an organization, although we can, when you work in government, dismiss an individual, right? So I think it's important to really recognize that skill set, that nexus of the toolkit is that community engagement, not just for one toolkit, but an ongoing accumulation of relationships to help do that. The last thing I'll share is just a bit about what we learned about implementation at the Race and Social Justice Initiative. You know, we had a required mandatory toolkit for about a decade. No one was doing it, right? Then we organized then Mayor Ed Murray to actually require each department director to do for a year, and then have those 4,
1 minute.
Thank you, then have those 4 toolkits be shared with the Race and Social Justice Initiative and council, right? And when we required that, ends up folks did it. And we didn't do that as a top-down strategy to make folks under directors do it. We did it because frontline workers who work for the city wanted to be made to do it because they weren't giving the space or the resources to do toolkits. So sometimes when we're on the inside, it looks like a bottom-down strategy, but it's really a top-down strategy, it's really a bottom-up strategy, right? And when we did that, we realized that folks didn't know how to do toolkits. And at RSGI at that time, we were smart enough to realize that wasn't their fault, that was our fault. You know, as a teacher, if I give everyone a quiz and every student misses number 8, that's not the student's fault, that's the teacher's fault. So we really retooled when I was there. I left my job about 3.5 years ago to really support folks in what does it mean to apply really well a toolkit. So I'll wrap up there and say that I do think these are about a transformational process, right? It's not about changing the product, the decision, it's about changing the process of the decision, which will hopefully result in permanent transformation of decision-making. Thank you, Benita. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Scott. So now we're going to have an opportunity to follow the panel member of your choice to one of the breakouts. And so in each breakout room, there'll be one of the panel members and then one of our planning team members who will serve as moderator. And they're in those sessions, the panelists will each have a chance to go more deeply into their use of the racial equity tool. And if time allows, perhaps even answer specific questions that you might have. And then so for the next hour, we'll be in those breakouts. Those who are in the breakout with Scott Wynn, basically you won't go to another breakout, you'll just stay right here, and the other 3 will migrate to other rooms. We will adjourn our session formally from the breakout room, so we will not be coming back together as a group. So I just would like the rest of you just to join me in just affirming our incredible panel members, Deshaun Quinn, Ricky Reyes, Brian Sandler, Scott Wynn. Can you join me in, cheer, however we want to do that? Yeah, that's right. We can do those little reactions, right? Okay. So with that, I'm going to ask our major moderators, Iman Ibrahim and Alaric Bien, to get us into our breakout rooms.
All right, you will be moved into your breakout room and we'll have to choose join. If you are in the wrong breakout room, please send me a message and I will do my best to enter you. So here we go.
Benita, I just sent you a little chat box.
Okay.
And I'll be back in about 2 minutes, okay?
Okay. All right. So since we are in a breakout session, if you have the bandwidth to turn your camera on, your webcam on and be visible, we're going to ask that you do that so we have more of a sense of community in our breakout. It's great to see faces, isn't it? There are downsides to this virtual work. And, I'm a relational person. I wish we had time to just go around the room and have each of you introduce yourselves. But maybe we could at least say hello in the chat box. Scott will be back in a minute to pick up on this session. And, please, if you have questions or if something's not clear, please put it in the chat box. My role is to monitor the chat box and to be sure that Scott's aware of questions that you have. Okay. So we do have a large, I'm looking at, we've got about 77 participants in our breakout. And so we have a lot of people who will be listening. And, once again, I just really want to welcome you and just tell you, as one of the planning team members, how affirming it is to see all of you here for this session. We will be sending you a post-event feedback survey for feedback and input. We used it from our first session to get input to see what people wanted to hear in this session. So if there are particular focus areas that you would like us to delve into in future sessions, when you get your survey link, please let us know, because we're really working to meet your needs. So with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'll moderate the chat box to see if there are questions, if you don't mind me kind of interrupting from time to time. But go ahead.
Of course, interrupt me anytime you want to. I'm so excited to be in this space with Benita. She and I actually do a lot of work together. So it's really great to, usually we're co-doing things. I love that you're moderating me. We'll see how well that goes, huh?
I know we get to switch roles and wear these different hats, but in all transparency, Scott is not only a member of my extended family, but one of the most powerful colleagues that I work with, and we've worked together for years. So yeah, it's a joy to share some space with you again, Scott.
Thank you, Benita. So wonderful to see you. Well, hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have this conversation, this chance to go a bit deeper. I'm going to kind of go over a bit the PowerPoint with a few more details and thoughts. I actually would love that anytime you have a question while I'm talking, just to say you have a question. You can unmute yourself, and we're going to kind of flow that way. And would love to hear, as Benita said, questions you have, things you really want to contemplate. I have a lot of, as you can tell, a lot of vast experience doing toolkits for a long time. So I'd love to be able to share lessons I've learned. And also you all can share some lessons you've learned as, excuse me, as you all are beginning to engage. I see that I didn't realize this is for folks new to using racial equity tools, but that's great if that's true. So I'd love to really help support you all in launching these. So I'm going to go ahead and again share my PowerPoint. I'm not really sure. It's always so fun to know. I wonder how that went. My presentation, we'll see. So let me find that. Can you all see my PowerPoint now? Is it up? Great. Yeah, so I definitely do feel like, part of doing these toolkits is to get really clear. You can tell I love talking about strategy and strategic thinking, to get really clear that it is part of, as the title of your community is, about really governing and leading with racial equity. That lens is such a crucial lens, not just to end racism and to support folks of color, but because it's a strategy to create equity for all, right? That we recognize that racism has a lockdown on our systems. Actually, it stops, like as a gay man, I recognize that I will not be free until racism and white supremacy are loosened up from systems, because the current system doesn't have the capacity or desire to free even me as a white gay man. That, racial justice is a strategy, not necessarily ranking oppressions, it's a strategy of what it's going to take for us to win, right? I think that's a crucial thing that can get really tricky as we begin to implement racial equity toolkits, because then the question comes up, understandably, for LGBT folks, for women, disabled folks, what about us? What about us? And being able to say very clearly that, we're not going to stop, it's about working on race explicitly, not exclusively, right? That we're not going to stop talking about sexism, but we're going to talk about sexism with a racial equity lens, so we can make sure that we're looking at the barriers to opportunity and thriving that women of color face due to sexism. If we get rid of how sexism impacts women of color, we're automatically get rid of how it impacts white women, not the other way around, right? It's a leading with explicitly, but not exclusive focus, yeah? And so I've already talked about this strategy idea. I do think it is so important we get clear on our strategy, right? The strategy is thinking behind the roadmap, you know, the why we're going to do something. And tactics are what we do, the aligned incremental actions that work in tandem to move our strategy forward, right? And I already talked about this kind of ladder analogy, which really does help kind of coalesce this for me, because I do think so often we're having conversations about and or arguing about tactics. When we have a strategy and a vision, it then helps us create a container. So we're asking the right questions about what we're doing, right? And so I shared this idea already that, you know, I do think the heart of equity work is about decision making, right? I used to do a lot of work with LILO back in the day. LILO is a people of color-led organization, worker color-led organization. And one of their mottos was always nothing about us without us, right? That if a decision was going to be made affecting workers of color, they demanded to be part of that decision-making process. If not being at the table, making sure the deciders were at their table, right? This is a slide that I think is really helpful in how we think about this work, because sometimes we're trying to institute toolkits without being clear about where we are in historical trajectory, right?
Stop.
Did someone say Scott, or is that not?
Oh, I'm sorry. I muted. I wasn't mute. Sorry.
No worries. Good to see you, or good to hear you. You know, up until 1965, race was used explicitly by governments to make horrible decisions to mess over communities of color. And that was legal, right? Because of the brilliant gains of the Black-led civil rights movement, we ended that, right? Race was no longer allowed to be used in decision-making. So we entered, if you will, a colorblind era, which locked in the current system and locked in the current inequities. Now what we're trying to do is bring back race into decision-making in order to, Benita, look, I noticed you're on that slide. Did you see? There's Benita on the slide. She's there by that police officer. I hadn't noticed that before. And so now we're trying to actually bring race back into decision-making for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons, to consider the impact of racism, genocide, enslavement, and bordering on communities of color, recognize folks are situated differently in relationship to barriers and opportunities, therefore from an equity lens need something different to get folks there, right? So it can be helpful to name that, because there is a way where we think using race in decision making is racist. It very well might be. It might actually be anti-racist, right? And sometimes we really need to do a lot of level setting so these toolkits, as we introduce them, adopt them, they can fly and not become stagnant, right? And this is just a kind of a chart. You know, this is just how we make decisions in general. We have a desired outcome. What do we want? Then we find out where we're at by looking at the data. And then we do something. And then we evaluate to see if it got us closer there, right? And so what we're trying to do in that basic decision making, which is what we all do all the time, is add race into every aspect of the decision making model, right? Make sure our desired outcome is a racial outcome. Make sure the data we're looking at is racialized data, disaggregated and clear, making sure the action we take uses all the best practices of our racial equity lenses, our target universalism, all that kind of stuff. And then we see if it works. And we see if it works because we have an outcome we're going to compare it to, right? Equity work, we measure success by looking at outcomes. In diversity work, we measure success by looking at diversification, by counting who's there. That's a key indicator of equity, but equity becomes more outcome focused. We backward map from the outcome, right? If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. And having an outcome is a lot harder than making a decision just about today. I have a 6-year-old.
Are you going to speak a little bit more to targeted universalism?
I can. Do you want me to do a little definition of that right now? Yeah, sure. So that's a term coined by John Powell. John Powell is like one of the most brilliant folks doing this work. He's I kind of consider him the father of kind of something happened to my PowerPoint, which is fine, but I'll throw it back up. But target universalism is this idea that in doing our work, we must have a universal goal, a universal outcome we're trying to get everybody to, and then we target resources towards those furthest away from that goal to make sure everyone gets there, right? So I did a lot of work in Seattle Public Schools when I worked for the city. I was the educational equity lead. You know, right now, about 90% of white kids graduate from Seattle Public Schools, and about 60% of Black, Latino, Native, and Samoan youth graduate. Our goal is not to get kids of color to graduate at a rate of 90% like their white peers, right? Racial equity is not the equal distribution of racial inequities, right? Our goal is to get every single kid to graduate. because we care not just about the 10% of kids of color who wouldn't be graduating, because we also care about the 10% of white kids who aren't graduating. So a targeted universal goal helps us realize equity is a win-win situation for all of us, right? That it's not something that, for example, white folks do to be nice to folks of color. It's a necessary thing to benefit all of our communities, that it's a win-win situation, right? I'm curious, it sounds like any kind of quick thoughts folks are having or anything as I'm pulling up my screen, questions.
Sorry, this is a logistical question. I think maybe the other two breakout rooms are
Yes.
closed.
I was just going to make an announcement. We had, a technical issue. So we just put everyone back into the breakout room, but you have to click join in order to join that breakout room. So look around on your screen for a join button.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So it sounds like I can keep going and folks will accept the invitations and come and go as we go. I won't take it personal if folks are suddenly dropping like flies from the workshop, right? Hopefully you all can get where you want to go. And so yes, that target universalism is kind of a lens. It's one of our equity lenses in how we do the work to make sure everyone gets there, yeah? I talked about inside-outside strategy a bit, and I do think it is really key that we get clear about our role when we're on the inside. You know, I often, I was going to talk about that long-term outcome. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and you know, I realized that as I make decisions around her, I'm making decisions around what I think her 25-year-old self needs from me. It's a lot harder than what she needs from me right now, right? Or what I need to do right now to get through the moment. And it really ups the ante on a vision that I have for her as a clear and centered person at 25. It changes that, right? And so when we get really clear about long-term outcomes, it changes what we do today to shine a light towards that outcome, right? Not just to do a tactic well, but to do it well so it leads up and accumulates and builds to something, right? And these inside-outside strategies just a really, I think, important lens in order to think about how we do the work, right? And get clear about our role. Clearly, as we all know, there are many of us we're both on the outside and the inside. You know, we're at a spot where the #1 employer of living wage jobs in our country is actually the public sector for folks of color, right? That the outside, the communities are inside. So we all have differing, you know, you can't ever let go of a hat you have on, but it's helpful for me to get clear about what's possible where I'm at, right? When you're on the inside, you use your inside voice, like I tell my daughter. Like when I worked for the city, I wasn't gonna occupy the mayor's office. That's an outside tactic, right? On the inside, it might be letting the outside folks know the mayor's schedule if I have access to that, right? But so there's a way we're getting really clear about where we can leverage and where we can have the most influence is really helpful around inside-outside strategy. Any thoughts on anything so far? Feel free not to, but if folks wanna jump in, I'm happy for that to happen. Oops, I accidentally did that, was my fault.
Any thoughts, questions, something that you hope that you would get an answer to during this session? Just unmute and share, because Scott would really like to hear from you.
Hi, Scott. I'll jump in if I may.
Thanks, Alex.
Alex Hunt with the City of Burien. We've got a council and a commission and staff who are really on board and understand the role that city governments must play to forward these equity goals. But I think that we're looking for ways structurally to like document and forward that as we implement specific plans. Like we have sustainable climate action plans and sub-area plans that we're going through right now. And we have equity baked into those plans, but how do we ensure in the long term that equity is kind of cooked into everything that we do? I know we're talking a lot about racial equity toolkits. Do you think that's kind of necessarily the best way to do that? Or are there other methods that a city government could use to achieve kind of that goal of like a high level policy that or framework that forwards equity goals overall?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex. And I think I get what you're getting at. I do think that racial equity toolkits primarily are a way to operationalize racial equity decision making, and that eventually we wouldn't need them. Because once we operationalize it and it becomes the new business as usual, we might not need a formal clunky toolkit, right? But so it is an ongoing iterative process to strengthen that muscle of what it means to engage in equity work, right? I think, systems are like rubber bands. If you stretch them one way, they snap back. Like the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. So I think they are a key tactic. I also think, though, without a context around them as a tactic, they can fall flat. So like when I work with an organization as a consultant, we have a workshop. We first align around a frame, a set of languages, a strategy, right? And the workshop's not the work, but the work often doesn't happen very well without the workshop, right? You need that get folks in the same chapter of the same book, maybe on the same page, right? You can't really do this work if you're all reading different books. Like a book club where folks read different books is no fun. Just like doing this work, we got to have some basic align things. And then I support organizations in creating just a one-page document. What is your commitment to racial equity? Why is it necessary to do this work to achieve your mission, your goals, and your vision, right? And getting really clear on that. And that's when you bake it in. We have a 5-year strategic plan. Pillar 1 says this. We recognize we can't achieve climate, whatever you said, without leading with the racial equity lens and making sure we understand how communities of color are impacted by that and how their perspectives is necessary to win that. So you that document is, it's the baked inness, you really make it clear. And then you do the work to set long-term audacious racial equity outcomes, right? Racial equity income, racial equity in health disparity, or health equity and whatnot. And then that becomes your North Star document, which then becomes the first page of your racial equity plan, or ideally your whole strategic plan, right? I sometimes you need to have separate plans. It's actually usually better to have one plan that has it, as you said, Alex, baked in, right? Baked into the whole thing. And so I do think that's the kind of process that which can be helpful, and that can help it survive. The most important work we do in working with government is with staff. Elected officials come and go, right? There's staff going to be there for 30, 40 years. That is actually the folks that can make permanent this work. And I think whenever we get, though, a formal adoption of these kind of racial equity commitment statements, that's when new folks come on and you learn, oh, that's just what we do here. This is how we do that. And then it also allows staff and community folks to hold the institution accountable for saying what it said it was going to do, right? It can look like an optical thing, like, everyone and their dog did a statement about Black Lives Matter in May. Lots of those were pure optics. But now folks are saying, you said this, what are you doing about it? So I do think, Rick talked about the, white supremacy culture, and worship of the written word is one of those manifestations. It also is an important part of this work. Writing something down in institutions means something. So that's a bit of what I'm thinking around that. And I think there is about really having an ongoing plan of recognizing that these toolkits are learning tools. And when they're aligned, they can lead to different outcomes. Did that help at all, Alex? Was that getting a little bit?
Yes, that was super helpful. Thank you, Scott.
Oh, good. Thank you. And so I'm going to keep chucking along until someone has a thought or question, which I'd love to hear. I talked about the whole, there is a way I think that people often racial equity toolkits are merely only seen as community engagement. And I do think that is a crucial part. That's what we're trying to make sure happens, because we often are pretty good at convening stakeholders as governments make decisions, but we often at that table are not those most impacted. So it's not that we stop talking to experts on something, but we recognize we need lots of different kinds of expertise, and we make sure we center the voices and choices of those most impacted, right? And so the goal of them is to apply this lens, but like I said, it's to make sure we're applying this lens well, that we're applying this lens with the appropriate and necessary perspectives of those most impacted, right? And so, I did talk about the steps of this, and I want to I don't know if I need to go over them because I guess I just did a half hour ago, but I want to talk a bit more about setting outcomes, because I think that is really an important skill that I kind of hinted at earlier. let's see what this first. Oh, well, this is from Metros. They're on the verge of adopting this, that Portland outfit. And step one is to have an internal stakeholder team. An essential intervention of toolkits is to make decision-making a collective phenomena, not an individual phenomena, right? If one person's making a decision, it is never as good as if 2 or 3 make it, right? Let alone 5, 6, or 7, or 8, let alone a set of diverse folks with differing perspectives around that, right? And so convening that internal stakeholder can be really impactful and helpful. Also, when you get really clear about what power that group has. Often we convene internal stakeholder groups and we lend themselves and ourselves to think that we have the power to decide. Rarely do we, but we have the power to influence the power brokers and decision makers. And getting clear on that can help us make sure we're utilizing the power we have as strategic as we can, right?
There's a question from Nicole.
Great. Should I read it, or is it long, or are you gonna verbalize it, or should I read it?
It's not. Hi, this is Nicole. It's not. I didn't actually put the question in the chat. I did have a question. So is now an okay time to ask?
I love it. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. So I am the manager of equity and inclusion at Sound Transit. And we recently just developed our first draft of a racial equity toolkit, as well as an equitable engagement toolkit that goes hand in hand. And, we're in the stage right now of piloting both of these things with the agency. And we're running up against a couple of things, and I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts and feedback on. One is that we're finding that, and it goes back to what you were speaking about earlier around helping people to really apply the tool. And what we're running into is really, how do we help people who are not at all versed in racial equity work, who really, they've never really had these conversations or assessed or analyzed decisions from this perspective. How do we get them to lead this process? It almost seems like they need to have some type of foundational competencies to engage in this work, which isn't necessarily sustainable for the long term, right? Because we're on our side of the office, it's me and one other person. So we can't be at every single table to provide kind of that subject matter expertise. So I'm wondering how you've seen that be successful in the past with, again, how do we apply this with, again, folks that are not necessarily versed in this work? And then the other piece is if you have recommendations for how we think about long-term implementation of this tool. I think there's some fear on the behalf of the agency to kind of allow anyone and everyone to have access to this, because I think people feel like they need a certain amount of oversight as to how people, fidelity to the tool, getting people out of this framework of like, this is a recipe and you complete step 1, 2, and 3 to get to a certain outcome. So I'd be interested to know what you've seen be really successful in implementation and what you've kind of seen be a downfall of how these get implemented. Hope those are clear.
No, it's good. I mean, they're great questions, and they are kind of the question, right? Like, how do you make this successful? And the first of all I would say is that, as we know, any tool in the wrong hand can be a harmful tool, right? So there is a way where we do need folks, that internal stakeholder team needs to go through some alignment to make sure they're on the same page. So I do think there's a way where the workshop's not the work, but a workshop is necessary to get folks in line. It's also not in alignment. It's also helpful, I think, to think about just that principle of we can't let perfect get in the way of the good, right? I could spend this exact same hour talking about how horrible these processes are going, right? Like, as an organizer, as folks, as leaders in racial equity, we're often performing hope. We're performing the possible stuff. We're not talking about sometimes the negative part. But this is hard work. And recognizing that we can't let perfect get in the way of the good, that it's not about perfection, it's the direction, is a really helpful frame. That every toolkit's going to be flawed. Can we evaluate it after it's done and say, what did we learn, right? What did we miss? What did we get? And so I do think there is a way we're really seeing it. I often call it as an experiment. It's an experiment to try to do things differently, right? And try to operationalize an alternative way of doing things. And the more we have kind of spaciousness around that, it can be really helpful. And I do think it makes sense, elected officials, folks, bosses, they're really, these once something gets written down, they know that it can become a little devilish for them, right? So everyone is all about it until it's here, and then it becomes a lot trickier. So there is a way where we got to be strategic in how we do this work, but we can't be so strategic that we don't do the work well, right? I do think there's a way where, you know, there's a great resource. I don't know how Sound Transit's doing their work, but GREI, Government Alliance on Race and Equity, has a good resource on building core teams or internal teams of folks doing the work. And I do think one of your goals and roles, Nicole, as I'm sure you're aware, is to make sure that, you know, the great part about your job is that your job exists. The bad part is everybody thinks, oh, Nicole's handling that, right? I'm sure you've gotten that experience, right? And we have to make sure that we replicate you and that you exist everywhere, and that you got to train folks up for that, right? Like, so a 6 month, a year-long cohort of folks doing that, and then each of them has an internship where they have to do a toolkit in their department. I mean, that's a great way. And then create a learning community around that, where you are present at the learning community. You're not present at every table discussing the toolkit, right? And so I do think there's a way where learning communities of praxis, reflective action can be really helpful. And just setting the stage that this probably is going to go well. You know, Sound Transit has some great relationships with folks of color, just like every institution, and some not so great ones with folks of color, just like every institution. Like, it is a bumpy road, right? And when you show up for the 8th time and say, we're here, we want to know what you think, folks are like, yeah, you didn't really seem to care much last time. I'm not trying to talk about Sound Transit in particular. I'm using you all as a typical example of all of our government institutions, right? So I do think it is around, you know, around that. I think it's also about making sure some of these internal teams include your bosses and include council. You know, it's really, one, it's easy to critique something you're not part of. It's hard to critique something that you're part of, because then you're responsible for it too, right? And when you support folks in being decision makers for a process, then they're going to own it, and then they're going to feel better about it at the end. That, you know, racial equity toolkits, if it becomes a final report, isn't a weapon you throw at council or throw at your bosses. It's a tool to help your bosses do what they've said they're going to do, right? So I don't know if I got rambly on that, or if any of that supported your question. Any thoughts you have back, or questions you have back, or things you've learned about your own question?
Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful, and that's it reaffirms kind of the direction we were going or thinking about going in terms of how we kind of spread ownership for this work across our agency. So no, that's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is around, what is it? Setting goals and outcomes, right? And it is, like I said, important that we have ideally a work plan that these toolkits are part of furthering, right? I do think a work plan really does help make sure that what you're doing is moving you all forward. And so it's important that we get really clear about, you know, what are the long-term racial equity outcomes you're trying to get at, and what are short-term equity goals that can help build towards that, right? And so it's really important then to get clear about what is an outcome and what is a goal. An outcome is a condition we aim to achieve in the community. That's from GREI. It's the elimination of a racial inequity. It's a desired condition. It is usually long-term, or it's long-term, possibly unachievable in our lifetimes, but it is that North Star, right? The North Star is a navigational tool in sailing. It makes sure you go in the right direction, right? The North Star was also the name of Frederick Douglass's abolitionist newspaper in the 1800s to abolish slavery. The North Star is that guiding document, taking folks to freedom from the South, right? So having that is really, people get excited sometimes having a vision and knowing why they're doing something, right? A goal is just an achievable shorter term step that's going to get you towards that outcome. Most goals are achievable, meaning they should be measurable so that you can have some wins. You know, your goal isn't racial equity to achieve your outcome the next year. It's to, for example, increase graduation rates by 10% over the next year. You know, we need to have measurable goals so then we have something to say, wow, we didn't do it. Why didn't we? What do we need to redo because we didn't reach our goal, right? And so here's an example of a goal. This is from a worksheet we created when I worked at RSJI. You know, a common goal might be this: to improve information sharing and outreach to Seattle residents who may be least likely to apply or otherwise access Office of Housing funded programs. What's wrong with that as a goal? This is a fake one, so I'm not trying to harsh on OH, but this is a typical goal of departments and governments. Any thoughts on this?
It doesn't really include a measure.
Absolutely, there's no measure, right? It's kind of like what I said earlier, to improve. Well, what does that mean, right? What else might be a problem with it?
Too vague.
It's vague, absolutely.
Someone in the chat room said not smart.
So SMART is what? Strategic, measurable. I forget SMART, but it's not SMART, right? Can you share what SMART is in the chat room, that person? I mean, part of it is, even if it was 100% successful, that you just didn't, not only if you didn't just improve information sharing, but you shared information, let's say, with every single person of color in Seattle. Like Gwen said, who cares? What if it's bad information? What if the information doesn't lead to anyone accessing the programs? And what if it's not leading towards creating racial equity in housing, right? So sometimes we do stuff that we focus on the inputs, not on the outcome, right? And so an outcome would be to achieve racial equity in housing, access and ownership in the city of Seattle. Like, that is a North Star goal, where we then can say, wow, we've increased by 90% the information about our programs. People aren't accessing it, and or they're not getting into housing, and we're not reaching our equity. Maybe the information's wrong. Maybe the whole thing is wrong, right? And so it allows a criteria of success to become more apparent, right?
Scott, in the chat, it says SMART is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, and this one is, that first one's not SMART. I mean, the outcome isn't really SMART as well, but it's not a goal, it's an outcome, right? Like I do think there's a way where we shy away from setting outcomes. One, we're not really socialized to be very visionary in our society, like many of us, right? We're socialized to get it done, to feed the family. We're not socialized, there's some nihilism around this, but this putting out, I think it's motivating for folks to be really purpose driven, right? Often HR becomes a big point where we do a lot around, we hire folks of color, and then we really want to work at retention and promotion. So the big thing folks do is to have programs for workers of color around to try to retain and promote folks. Those programs often, one, they say the problem is the people of color, not the system, right? And two, again, just because you could get every person of color to go through the program, but if you've not changed the system, the deciders, the power brokers around them, it doesn't matter, right? And so not that we shouldn't do those, but sometimes that's the only thing that's being done, if that makes some sense, right? So that's kind of setting outcomes. I do think that's a collective process. You can also do a toolkit on outcomes. Do the residents and citizens of Burien like the outcomes you set? Do folks of color think you made the mark? That's a process of community engagement, not just to share folks what you decided, but let folks in on the process of making the decision, right? What's next here? So the next is really, access community data, right? And this is not just the numbers, but also the stories of what's the current situation around educational equity or transportation equity, right? And get really clear through this to find out who is furthest away from equity, right? So then you can engage that targeted universal strategy to make sure that if you're working to get rid of all the barriers folks furthest away are experiencing, everyone's going to get there, right? And so once you do that, you determine the most impacted community or communities, then you engage with folks, right? And I think the community engagement is a really key part. I sent that document out. I was actually going to print this out for myself right here. The document I sent out, or that I posted in the chat box, it's only, well, now it's about a year old, I guess, but it's so good and so clear and really gets at how do we engage with folks and move towards ownership, right? Because the often thing we do is on the worst case scenario on this continuum, this spectrum, is we ignore folks. And we ignore folks, we support their marginalization. The next step up is we inform folks, right? The next step up is we consult with folks, often in a tokenizing way, where you're asking folks' opinion. You're assuming people present represent communities instead of merely only share a connection and one perspective of a community, right? I really shy away from the phrase representing and talk about connecting. I don't represent all gay men, but I do share a connection to the perspective of me as a gay man, right? It's a burden, it's tokenizing to expect anyone to represent their community, which is why I talked about the idea of organizations. Organizations of folks from a community who've done work together, then you're getting a lot closer to potentially representing a wide swath of a community, right? And then sometimes we move from tokenization to actually involving folks where their voice actually matters and is informing things. And then we collaborate sometimes, we're actually sharing some power around decision making. And the final stage is that a community decides, right? Often what we do, and King County actually has a really good spectrum like this as well. I'm not sure if it's still up in the air, but it's really helpful. It's similar to this. There's nothing wrong with having a community meeting where you inform folks of something. It's often though we aren't clear that's what we're doing. We act like we're engaging instead of just informing, right? It's okay to have a community meeting where you just gather in some information. It's not that those things should never happen. It's just that when we aren't clear why we're doing something, it sets up mistrust of communities to ever show up again, right? And to be clear, it's very rare. There's, City of Seattle has done some great participatory budgeting stuff, really trying to say the community is going to side this decision. You have it's not the city budget, it's a section of that, but we need to, now more than ever, particularly given this current election, like we need to practice democracy. Democracy is so hard. Joe Biden said it's messy, and it is, but we need to practice democracy by creating spaces to be democratic, right? Where decisions that impact people involve people. And so that spectrum can be really helpful on that resource I shared, because it also shares what's done during those different phases. So it shares different things to do in these different phases. The whole thing is just really good. It's also, it ends with a great curriculum of how do you have this conversation with a work group, with a project team. So it's kind of not just information, it's how can you apply on your own, right? So this then becomes just the crucial part, where you're really trying to gather the voice and choice so you can then apply a racial equity lens. Then you can get to really who will benefit and burden from decisions, because you engage with those folks to say, what do y'all think of this? How's it going to benefit? How's it going to harm? What's something we could maybe, since we've not yet made the decision, because that's what happened. Toolkits are often, they're done so often more to evaluate the past instead of future into the future, right? And ideally they're a futuring tool, not an evaluation tool. It does define a good process for evaluation though, to make sure folks of color are included in evaluation, but more and more they need to be used to make decisions, right? And then it's so important once you, once you make the decision that you go back to the communities and share, hey, here's the input we got from you. You type it up, you let folks know what you got. One, so folks can say, yeah, that's what we said, right? And then two, you share, you recommended the following 5 things. We did 3 of them. Number 4, we couldn't do. We didn't have the resources. You should talk to council and get the resources for that. We couldn't do it. Number 5, I'm making this up, it's illegal to do that or something, but you go back and you share how their voice impacted the choice and how it didn't. We couldn't do that. There was not the political will of the council or the department director or the staff, right? And so that you build trust by being clear and transparent with people, not, I was going to say blowing smoke someplace, but I don't know what to say. Not just being truthful.
While you're thinking.
Yeah.
It's not blowing smoke up anywhere. Okay.
Yeah.
How can we address the perceived barrier of lack of time and resources that prevent meaningful engagement? And then another question for you, we were talking about engagement. Would this be similar to participatory action research?
Yeah, I would say there is a way where I think racial equity toolkits and participatory action research is which is, so folks know, it's a research model where you engage with folks and research what folks want to learn about and what will benefit them. You don't research people, you research with people. Someone who said that probably has a better way to say it than I do, but it's actually a big research module in social work where I teach. So it's very similar. It is just about really making sure, I love that little phrase, you can tell the voices and choices of folks impact decision-making, right? Their first question was around?
First question basically was around
time.
Addressing perceived barrier, lack of time and resources.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a way. One, it is real in the current conditions when we're held accountable to efficiency instead of equity, there aren't enough time and resources to do this work. So part of this is to keep raising more and more awareness as we do these. We need more time and resources, right? That we need to be given. A toolkit's not done at the desk. It's done in the community. It takes months or 2 or 3, right? And so it is about continuing to raise awareness that y'all said in your racial equity commitment statement, you're trying to do this. Y'all pass this tool. If you want us to do it, we need time and resources, right? It doesn't mean we need to make sure Nicole at Sound Transit's doing it all. We need departments to have times and resources and skilled up workers to be able to do this, right? So I guess my question for that is like, there is a perception of not having enough. It can be real sometimes, but that's because we live with myths of, the myth of scarcity instead of the reality of abundance, right? There's a lot more possible when we make equity our bottom line, not merely efficiency, so to speak. So I think it's about raising awareness of that and recognizing it's going to happen, right? So that's kind of the, what time is it? We have 20 minutes left. That's kind of stuff I wanted to walk through. And I'd be curious to hear other questions like the one you've asked around successful implementation, how to set the conditions up for this, questions for me about my experiences, telling a great story of success. If someone has a brieferish story to share of success. Benita, what are you thinking?
One of the things that resonated with me, and it kind of touches on this time and resources question, when you were on the panel, you said, using a racial equity tool is not about changing the decision. It's about changing the process that we use to make the decision. So, I think bottom line, we're going to make decisions, in government entities, we're going to make decisions. And so, but what is the process that we use? And that is the difference. And, there's a part of me that says, using a racial equity tool is nothing more than moving to a new normal about, what's our decision-making approach. So we always say, well, it's going to take time, it's going to take resources. Well, guess what? Everything new does. I'm going to get off my bandstand. But anyway, I just wanted to elevate that a little bit.
Thank you. I love that. And definitely, I talk about the workshop that I do to help the work happen is called Leading with a Racial Equity Lens for Structural Transformation. A lot of smarty pants word, but definitely the frame I come from in this work is not a transactional frame, it's a transformational frame. And it's not a dismantling frame. I joke that when I used to be a young soldier for the revolution, now I'm an old soldier for the transformation, right? Like it actually feels more possible for me to transform our systems than to tear them down and start over. Transformation means you take what is and make it what you want it to be, right? I first learned the word transformation in 2nd grade. It's one of my favorite words. When I learned about the caterpillar becoming the butterfly, it's a transformation. The thing about the caterpillar is it contains the cells of the wings of the butterfly, right? Like I actually think we got what we want. This room is beautiful. This room just needs to be able to fly in institutions, right? We need the wings of equity, if you will, to be allowed to flourish. So that transformational frame helps me think about the toolkit then being about transforming decision-making. Right now in Seattle, we have a conditions where the city, King County, Seattle Public Schools, Seattle Housing Authority, Sound Transit have all adopted and are trying to use these toolkits. If we can all actually be implementing this kind of a process, and I'm just talking about Seattle, obviously Renton, our region, I should make sure I'm regional in this workshop, right? Thank you, Benita. you know, that we actually have the possibility of transforming our structures. We got really good for a while looking at institutional racism, kind of what's happening in the schoolhouse and what's happening in the jailhouse. A structural frame says what's happening between the schoolhouse and the jailhouse, which means we got to get the schoolhouse and the jailhouse talking in order to transform business as usual so we can change outcomes. To do that, we got to decide we want to have some outcomes, right? We got to decide what we're trying to get to. Sounds like Jessica has a question if you want to ask that, Jessica.
Yes. On the last slide or the slide before, you had holding people accountable. One issue that I have noticed in my equity work is you'll have people and we're teaching them about how we're doing equity now, and they're resisting. But then there's no consequence for it. What are some examples in the companies you've worked with where they do hold people accountable when they act a fool?
That's a great question. I do think it's important to talk about accountability because it's become such a kind of word. It feels like it's a weapon, right? That accountability is a weapon. It's also used to imply that we can arrive there, that I can be an accountable white person. You know, CAR-W, the Coalition of Anti-Racist Whites, which I'm one of the co-founders of, we spent 2 months' time creating a document on accountability. And we defined accountability as a set of relational practices, right? That without a relationship, you can't have accountability, right? And accountability is not just saying you did wrong, it's also saying you did right. Like accountability is also lifting up successes and lifting up good behavior, not just challenging bad behavior, right? And I think when it comes to governmental work and systems work, it's about operationalizing accountability into policies and practices. Does your annual performance evaluation of employees contain racial equity effort, right?
No.
Does the mayor have racial equity efforts as part of her accountability agreements with the department directors, right? Do the workers get to evaluate the bosses on how they think they're doing on racial equity? That kind of 360 idea, right? So I think it's so key. When I worked for the city, one department worked to implement racial equity in their annual performance evaluations. And again, it looked like a top down to get the bosses to judge and assess folks below them. The frontline workers actually organized to get that passed because it then required their bosses to figure out what it might take to evaluate them on racial equity, right? And then it was a small tactic to change the institution, right? And then the first year, it was just about yes or no. Did you do anything for racial equity this year? And then there was a list of things: attend a workshop, be on a toolkit team, whatever it is. It was easy. And the next year it became a scale of 1, 2, or 3. You know, then it becomes when people are more clear how to do that, then they can be assessed instead of yes or no, it can be assessed on how well or deep or wide they did the work. So I think there is a ways where, again, you know, you don't want stuff to become so bureaucratic, but it's a bureaucracy. You gotta know where you are and what's going to transform, and getting policies and practices in there is really key, right? So that's one example, performance evaluations around that.
Thank you.
Then of course, as you all know, it's about making sure it's part of the job description. You know, that it's a job requirement, not a job, what do you call that?
Part of the job posting,
Yeah.
The job's open.
Yes.
Other questions, thoughts, comments?
I had a quick question about the tokenism slide, and because my colleague and I are in the human services arena and seen as the experts on equity for whatever reason, and have relationships with community members, we are often called to share our list. And it's really challenging for me because I do worry about like how our partnerships and relationships with these various community groups are being overtapped, and an absence of this real dedication to everybody need to lift this up and have so that kind of scarcity of resources. So just, are there any other ways that, I was just trying to think about other ways that we go out to communities that are not, because every time we have a plan that we want to take forward, there's all that time, 3 months, oh, weigh in on the housing action plan, weigh in on the comp plan, weigh in on environmental sustainability. There's so many things that we want to get community input on. So you have thoughts about how to do that in a way that's not convening groups and mindful of resources.
No, I appreciate that, Brooke. It's a great question. Maybe other folks have some things that have worked where you're at. I think there's a good program. I think Neighborhoods at Seattle still has it. It's not called the Trusted Advocates, but it's actually hire folks who are connected to communities in order to build and strengthen those relationships, right? So it is one. Say it again.
Community liaisons.
Yeah. It's a program. I think if you did some research, i.e. Googled it, you could probably find out, their little resource sheet around it. And it is one way to really, I liked how no, it wasn't Rick. It was Councilmember Quinn talked about, they paid the folks for their engagement. That actually matters.
And Brooke, I think that there's kind of a growing trend that I see in the region. Typically government entities haven't paid like people who sit on boards, commissions, committees, because generally we're talking about once a month, once a quarter, 2 or 3 times a year, something like that. But when people are asked to do things like the community liaisons are in Seattle, go out and solicit input from their community, or in the city of Renton, for example, over the last 2 years and 3 different occasions, departments have asked for help from community members in holding, focus groups in their community or in sharing information in their community. And they see that as an extension of doing city work. And in all 3 cases, they were able to write grants where they actually paid stipends to people for their time. We did the same thing recently in Renton for our Census 2020 campaign. We recruited and trained 31 community, what we called census ambassadors, to go out and engage their community. And we wrote and obtained a grant that allowed us to pay them a stipend of $25 an hour. And yes, Scott's right, Council Member Quinn mentioned that. For the work at King County. But so the question, the discernment, I think that people are wrestling with is, is this just kind of a once in a while meeting where maybe people come together for an hour a month? Or are we really asking them to spend more time? Because like the cabinet that Council Member Quinn talked about was about 10 hours of work a month. So it's kind of looking at what are you asking of people, and as Scott, I can't remember, was it your slide? Somebody maybe it was Ricky's who quoted Vu Lee, who's been a community organizer for years and a mentor of a lot of our young leaders in community organizing. But I remember one time when I was in the on the race and social justice team working with Scott, and I'd invited him to come to a meeting, and he said to me, I come to these meetings, I can't tell you how many times I'm requested by the city to come to meetings, and I come and I sit at the table, and everybody around the table, all the city staff are in paid time and I'm not. So you've got to ask those kinds of questions. What's equity in terms of what you're requesting of the community, and how do you make that happen? And just saying, well, gee, it's a biennial budget and there's no money in there, that's not enough. There are grants that can be obtained to make that difference. As a matter of fact, I think it was a grant that Councilmember Quinn talked about. So there are other ways of doing it, in non-traditional ways, but it's honoring and it's respecting the contribution of our community members.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that I think once you start doing these toolkits, it becomes really necessary to coordinate them across your bureaucracy, your city, your government, because you don't want, a public engagement meeting on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, we're all asking the same set of questions. They could be sharing the information at a database where you're sharing stuff. So you can say, wow, we're making this decision. We don't have time now. It's a quicker decision. Let's go back to what we learned last year through all of our engagement. Wow, there's a theme there. Maybe we don't need to bug everyone every time. You can like accumulate the outreach, right? And I think it's also really helpful whenever we engage with folks, not to share the decisions been made, but share some decision options. We often have these open-ended, what do you want to see? And that can just be so tedious, right? But when you say, here are 3 things we're thinking about, do any of these hit the mark? What might be some pros and cons? How might we get the best of all 3? That people, we get better feedback when we're asking for specific feedback sometimes. As long as we're not, you know, deciding, announcing, and defending, as long as we really are deciding, that's a process, right?
So by my clock, we've got about 6 minutes left, and I'd like to hold a couple of minutes for any closing remarks from Scott. So if you're sitting on a question that you'll be sorry you didn't answer, now's the time.
Iman put a great thing in the chat box as well, folks might want to look at, where, you know, she talked about asking folks what would be equitable, what would be fair. Like, instead of deciding what's fair, asking folks, there's a good chance they might say some money, or they might say policy. Like, I'll engage if y'all would do, you know, enact this policy or something, just make that up. But thoughts, questions, comments, anything?
Real quick question. Are you aware of any smaller jurisdictions that have successfully undertaken racial equity toolkits?
Is Renton small enough? Because I would think you would call it success, wouldn't you, Benita, what Renton's done?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, I think one of the things that, you know, I can't speak for Renton because I really support them as a consultant, but it's a learning process. You know, so it's like, you know, first time around, like Brian, you know, talked about, you know, how it was used to look at hiring practices. And that was really kind of the pilot, if you will, of the equity lens that Renton's using. And so a lot of that process was lessons learned and what would we do the same or what would we do differently next time. So now our administrative services or finance department is looking at how to use that in creating equity for contracts and vendors. And so, you know, it's a building process. You know, I have worked with, you know, most of my clients are in government and nonprofit, and I've worked with nonprofit organizations of like, say, 50 people who've used a racial equity lens in their work. Scott, we've worked with a couple of clients even smaller than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it can work on a small scale. And I think what's really great, whenever the city of Seattle, once the toolkit started going, community groups are demanding that we did a toolkit. That's when you know that something might be helpful, when folks know about it and they say, did you all do a toolkit on this? I understand Mayor Murray is requiring you to do this. Did you do it? Like that, you know, so it does become a tool, not just of the connection, but the accountability around that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Should I close this up, Benita? Do you want to close this up?
Thank you, Scott. I just, you know, in all the years that we've worked together, and I've told you this before, but, you know, every time I you know, get an opportunity to hear you make a presentation like this, I come away with new knowledge. I so value your wisdom and experience and your generosity in sharing. And you know, I just would hope that everybody here leaves with the same sense that I did, that you've got some information that you didn't have before coming that will help you on your journey. And, you know, like, I can't remember, there was some little cartoon character or who used to say, because people say, well, gee, we could try using a racial equity tool or racial equity toolkit. And, you know, I guess my response would be, don't try, do. You make it happen. And so I appreciate all of you, your questions, your comments in the chat. I just appreciate this forum today. So I would just like to end in a note of just mutual appreciation, because I'm certain that some of the questions that some of you asked were also questions that others asked. Scott, thank you. Just, I can't tell you how much we appreciate your being a part of this and taking us along on this journey. And I would just ask that you please respond when you receive the link for the survey to give us some feedback. We need your feedback. We're on a path of continuous improvement. So please be generous in your feedback. Scott?
Thank you so much for your generous appreciation, Benita. I feel really humbled and in awe to, one, be appreciated by you and to have the good opportunity to support you and work with you. So thank you so much. I also want to say I really appreciate you and Joe and folks who helped plan this for really doing what we said you would do. You know, I'm the only person on the panel who's not at their job right now. So y'all made sure that I got a little stipend. And Joe from King County Libraries, the King County Libraries are giving me a little stipend. So I appreciate that. That's putting your, you know, it's walking your talk. So appreciate that. I want to actually end with a poem. I love poems. And this is a poem by Daisy Zamora. She is a woman who helped fight the revolution in Nicaragua in the late 70s. And I think it's so, in a lot of this work, we can get so caught up on saying the right words and doing the right things, or more saying the right words. And this poem really, I think, really helps center me. It's called Precisely. Precisely because I do not have the beautiful words I need, I call upon my acts to speak to you. Thank you all so much. Go out there, keep doing good, be in touch. You're muted.
Thank you all. And that concludes our session today. Continue to be safe and be healthy, be patient with our election, and hope to see you all at a future forum. Bye for now.
Thank you.